Did it come in to tamper with the array the moment we left Puchi's shrine? Shichingshan asked, but immediately debunked his own theory. No, it couldn't have. Shelian agreed. That's impossible. Earlier, we had already pushed the door open, so even if it snuck in to meddle with things, we should have still arrived at our original destination. The array was already activated, so changing it wouldn't have done anything. So, it only had a split second to do something, which meant it was during that brief moment after Mingyi finished drawing the array, Shichingshan blew out the candles, and Puchi's shrine fell into complete darkness. However, that contradicted Shelian's own theory earlier. Shichingshan said, but earlier in the shrine, there was clearly only the four of us. In the tiny Puchi shrine, there were 3 heavenly officials and 1 ghost king. If there was anything extra, would they not notice? And if it was someone amongst them meddling in the darkness, who was the one who was most likely to do it? Shichingshan couldn't help but steal a glance at Hua Cheng. Although he stopped himself immediately, Hua Cheng didn't miss that glimpse. He smiled and said, "What's with that look? In my opinion, don't you think that Lord Earthmaster is the most suspicious one?" Mingyi's eyes also swept over. Hua Cheng added, "Instead of focusing on guessing who meddled after, what if the array he drew was wrong from the beginning?" Mingyi didn't rebuke, acknowledging nothing. Shichingshan, however, couldn't listen anymore. "Lord Hua," he said, "you stop right there, all right? I know the 2 of you have quarreled before in the past, but Ming Xiong really isn't someone like that. I dragged him out here last minute, so he has no reason to meddle." "You don't necessarily need a reason to do something," Hua Cheng said. "Lord Windmaster, you yourself are also suspicious." "Huh?" Shichingshan said. He had never thought the tables would turn on him, and pointed at himself. "Who? Me?" he asked. "Yeah," Hua Cheng said. "A thief crying thief is a common thing. Just why have you come? If you and your esteemed brother are truly scared of the Reverend of empty words, why were those rags cobbled together? It's not a stretch of the imagination to think that the 2 of you schemed and intentionally led us here." Just by looking at his expression, one could tell that he was cheekily speaking nonsense, but he looked so confident that almost anyone would start doubting too. Shichingshan was almost shaken. Am I that nonsensical?" he said. Hua Cheng chuckled. "Same logic," he said. "I'm not that nonsensical either." However anyone hit him, he'd hit right back in the same way. Shelian was still musing and waved his hand. "All right," he said. "Everyone stop. Nothing's been solved yet, and we've already started doubting our own people." Hua Cheng laughed out loud and stopped talking. However, his attitude was more than clear. He wouldn't help and he wouldn't cause trouble. He was purely there for fun. There was no need to expect anything from him, and there also wasn't any need to guard against him. After humming for a moment, Shelian said, "Actually, there's another possibility. After Lord Earthmaster had drawn the array inside the shrine, there was already someone else outside drawing a stronger array on the door. At the time, in order for Qirong not to hear, Shichingshan had cast a soundproof spell, sealing Puchi's shrine. If anything was tampered with on the outside, it wouldn't be easily detected from the inside. With 2 spells of the same caliber colliding, the more powerful one would win. This power didn't just depend on whether the caster was stronger, it also depended on the material used. At the time, Mingyi used the aged cinnabar that Shelian had picked up while collecting junk that even other scrappers had rejected. If someone had used fresh blood to suppress the array, it'd be stronger by a notch. Shi Qingxuan immediately accepted that possibility. Outside the shrine, he asked, could it have been the green ghost? Can he even do anything in that state? I don't think so, Shilian said. Hua Cheng said flatly, he can't even dream of moving in the next 7 days. But it wasn't just him outside the shrine. He seemed to be implying something. Shilian said, in any case, let's not panic and hurt our trust in each other. After walking a few steps, he added, but that monster's words were really strange. Why did it say that this place will become Lord Windmaster's nightmare that you never wish to remember? Are you going to run into anything here? Looking around, Shi Qingxuan frowned slightly. Wait, he said, is this? He hadn't even finished when suddenly Ming Yi's eyes grew sharp. His hand flashed out and chopped right for the back of Shi Qingxuan's head. Shilian shouted, Lord Windmaster, watch your back. Ming Yi's hand chop cracked a large rectangular object in two. That object came plunging down from above, right above Shi Qingxuan's head. He left a few feet away, patting his heart. That was close, he said. He looked down and his pupils shrank. Shilian approached to take a look and was also stunned. That object was an establishment plaque, colored with blue with golden characters spelling the words, Temple of Wind and Water. To shatter the establishment plaque of a heavenly official's temple was a huge taboo. Ming Yi dropped his hand, his expression icy. Shi Qingxuan was stunned for a moment, but immediately waved his sleeve, sweeping away the broken pieces of that plaque. He spoke in a small voice. Keep this a secret. No one say anything. Don't anyone speak of this. If my brother knew that his plaque was cracked, he'd get so angry. Shilian turned around, asking in disbelief, this is a temple of wind and water? Indeed, the broken-down house they ended up in was a temple of wind and water. The Water Master was a god of wealth. No one detested money, and the temples that worshipped him were always abundant in donations. To see one desecrated was as unimaginable as seeing a bundle of cash thrown out onto the streets, exposed to the elements without anyone picking it up. Shi Qingxuan rushed back to the hall anew. The interior of the temple was full of cobwebs and layers of dust, desolate from neglect. He rummaged around and finally pulled out 2 pitiful divine statues from a pile of rubbish. The divine statue of the Lady Windmaster was missing a leg and an arm, and the divine statue of the Lord Watermaster was straight up decapitated. The damage didn't look like it was from decay over the years, but rather like someone had used something sharp to smash them, as if they were venting infinite hatred onto the statues. Those 2 divine statues were also extremely realistic, almost as if alive. In this chilling temple, to see them lie on the ground with curved smiles on their faces in the state of unbearable abuse was exceedingly uncomfortable. Shi Qingxuan held a divine statue in each of his arms and wondered, what is this hate? What is this grudge? Even if Shilian felt this was a sight filled with malevolence, in order to steady Shi Qingxuan's mind, he replied gently, Lord Windmaster, steady yourself. As long as there are those who worship, there will be those who desecrate. It's a common sight in the world. No need to pay it any mind. This must be intentionally set up by that creature for the very purpose of fanning fear in your heart and absorbing spiritual power from you. Ming Yi, however, was succinct in his words. He asked, are you good or not? If not, leave. Shi Qingxuan wiped away the grime on the faces of those divine statues, and grit his teeth. He gripped his Windmaster fan and rose to his feet abruptly. "I'm good," he said. "Now I have to see just what that creature's made out of." The four exited the run-down temple of wind and water and walked around that little town. It was a very quiet town, peaceful, not bustling, but not behind the times either. Nothing out of the ordinary. Rather, the most bizarre thing was them. To be thrown into a crowd of mortals, their appearances, looks, and style were overly conspicuous. Thus, soon after, they ducked into a small alley and changed their attire. Shelian was already dressed plainly, so he didn't need to change, but the other three all changed completely from head to toe. On one side, Shiqingxuan was already having opinions on Mingyi's new getup. On the other, Huachang had changed into a set of refreshing black robes. His long hair had been neatly tied up with a white jade accessory. It exchanged his languid appearance for an air of youthful energy. He looked like an extraordinarily handsome, talented, and clever young disciple of some renowned house. He was still extremely conspicuous. An emperor really couldn't look like a beggar, even if you forced him to dress like one. Looking at him, Shelian couldn't help but remember the saying, "For men to look handsome, they must dress in all black." He thought deeply about the truth of the statement. Coming to, he looked over to the Lord Wind and Earth Masters and remembered something. He whispered, "Sanlang, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Huachang fixed his sleeves and said, "What is it?" Shelian clenched a hand into a fist and pressed it against his lips, clearing his throat lightly. He tried to sound extremely casual. "What's the verbal password to your private communication array?" he asked. In order to communicate and pass on messages directly through a private spiritual array, one must be able to receive the other party's verbal password. For example, to reach Shiqingxuan, one must loudly recite the 4 lines of the following verse. Lord Windmaster is boundlessly talented. Lord Windmaster is funny and carefree. Lord Windmaster is kind and righteous. Lord Windmaster is aged sweet 16. Of course, the majority of heavenly officials wouldn't set up verbal passwords that were so painful to say. Most of theirs were much simpler. The verbal passwords of heavenly officials in the upper court weren't given away freely, only to those who were close. As a supreme ghost king, Huachang was naturally the same. The two might not have known each other for long, but their relationship could be said to be fairly good. That they hadn't exchanged passwords yet was a little strange, but looking back, every time there was anything to be done, they had met directly, so exchanging passwords hadn't seemed to be a big deal. Shelian had never asked for the verbal password of any heavenly official. If anything should happen, he'd just call out within the spiritual communication array, and if he needed to speak to anyone privately, he could still ask for them in the array. This was also the first time he'd asked for someone's private communication first. He didn't have much prior experience, so he was a little worried that he might be too forward. Seeing that Huachang's eyes were twinkling, but he didn't respond, Shelian felt a little awkward. He hurriedly asked, "Is it inconvenient?" "Don't worry if it is. Don't mind me. I was just asking casually, because I wanted to discuss something privately later. I was being presumptuous. I can also try and talk to you in secret." Huachang cut him off. "It's not inconvenient. I'm really happy." Shelian was taken aback. "Huh?" he asked. Huachang sighed and said, "I'm really happy that Gege finally asked me. Because you never brought it up, I thought it was inconvenient for you, that you didn't want to exchange passwords with other people, so I never asked. Now that I finally had Gurga ask, how can you say it was only a casual request? Shillian let out a breath of relief and immediately brightened up, grabbing on to Hua Chang's hand. So we both had the same concern, he said. It was my mistake earlier. Those were just casual words. I apologize to San Lang. So your verbal password is... Hua Chang's eyes shimmered and he leaned over slightly. He said, "This is my verbal password. Gurga, listen closely. I'm only going to say it once." Then he whispered a phrase. After listening, Shillian's eyes widened. "What?" he asked. "Is it really that? San Lang, you didn't make a mistake?" Hua Chang looked at ease and replied, "Yes, that's it. If Gurga doesn't believe me, why not give it a go?" Shillian didn't dare. He said, Then doesn't that mean that every time someone tries to reach you, they have to mentally recite that phrase 3 times? Wouldn't that be very embarrassing?" Hua Chang snickered and said, "It's because I don't want anyone to reach me that I purposely set the password to that phrase. It lets them know to back off. But if it's Gurga who's trying to reach me, I'm always free." Shillian was feeling a little incredulous and thought, that's really me. He hesitated, wanting to initiate the private communication array, but he just couldn't recite those words no matter what. Even mentally, it was difficult. Seeing Shillian fretting, covering half of his face with his hand, turning his head away, Hua Chang finally had enough fun. He said, "All right, fine. If Gurga daren't recite it, then I'll be the one to reach you. What's your verbal password?" Shillian turned his head back and said, "Just recite the Ethics Sutra 1,000 times." Hua Chang cocked an eyebrow. A moment later, Shillian heard his voice next to his ear. "It's the phrase, just recite the Ethics Sutra 1,000 times, right?" The two were clearly standing facing each other, but their lips were closed, unspeaking. They were communicating with their eyes, whispering secrets to one another, using a voice that others couldn't hear, having a good time. Shillian replied, using the private communication array. "That's right. I can't believe you weren't fooled." Hua Chang blinked and continued to reply to his messages. "I was almost fooled. It's too good." Shillian also blinked, his delight apparent. It must be known that this verbal password was something Shillian came up with very seriously 800 years ago. He himself thought that it was fun, so he employed it after he ascended. Only not too many other heavenly officials found it amusing. Even after they were fooled, they were more speechless than entertained. Mu Jing told him directly, "Your Highness, your idea is terrible. Forgive me if I can't laugh." But Feng Xin laughed to the point of rolling on the ground, screaming himself hoarse. He was a person who laughed at almost any joke for no reason, so him laughing didn't make Shillian feel in the least bit accomplished. But since Hua Chang laughed, maybe that meant that it really was somewhat amusing after all. The original plan was to go to the best restaurant in the imperial capital to drink, but since they didn't make it to the imperial capital, it made no difference where they drank. The group went and reserved a room at the biggest restaurant in town, sitting around bored and spiritless. When the waiter brought their drinks, Shillian inquired, "May I ask just where this place is?" Although it was a blunt and strange question, it was still the most direct and effective way to gather information. The waiter was amazed. He said, "Did the honored guests not come because of our reputation? This is the town of Fugu." "Reputation?" Shillian asked. "What reputation?" The waiter gave a thumbs up. "Our town's fire social," he said. "It's really famous around here. Every year, around this time, there are quite a number of outsiders who come to watch the spectacle. Shi Xuan was curious. "What's a fire social?" he asked. Shilin answered, "Celebratory festivities during folk holidays. There will be some busking, some local plays, and so on. It's worth watching." It was similar to the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession of Shenle back in the day. However, the heavenly ceremonial processions were sponsored by the monarch, hosted by the authorities. Fire socials were festivals for commoners. Shi Qingshan commented, "But it's not a holiday today. At most, it's only the end of autumn tomorrow." "It doesn't have to be a holiday," Shilin explained. "Sometimes it's for remembering someone. The folks pick a special day to celebrate and have some fun." Just then, there was a huge commotion down the main streets below the restaurant. Someone was shouting, "Move, move, children and women, don't stand around. Back away, the troop is coming." The four looked below, and what a sight! Shilin's eyes immediately widened. There was a long procession parading down the main street, and in that procession, everyone was covered in heavy layers of bright, vivid makeup and dressed in strange and bizarre outfits. Also, there was a weapon embedded in each of their heads. Those sharp or dull axes, butcher knives, iron tongs, and scissors, they were all buried deeply in their skulls, piercing their brains. Some even had eyeballs squeezed out, hanging on their cheeks, dripping with blood. Some were stabbed from the forehead and pierced through the backs of their heads, exceedingly gory. All of the people parading had tightly knitted brows, their expressions full of agony, their faces covered in blood. Yet they continued to trumpet and play music, marching forward slowly, like a procession of ghostly spirits.